There are things for which people are willing to sacrifice everything. Fingers, life, family. The chance to go where no one has gone before is not just a competitive thrill. It is something more, something that forces you to rise in the darkness when everyone is shouting to turn back. In 1963, two climbers decided they knew the answer to the question, why? But history remembered another. 1963. The golden age of conquering summits was drawing to a close. Most of the planet's highest peaks had already been taken. Only one untouched 8,000er remained. 10 years earlier, in 1953, a British team had sent Sir Edmund Hillary and his partner Tenzing Norgay to the summit of Everest. They reached the highest point on Earth. There are legends that a year earlier, in 1952, the Soviet Union attempted an assault from the north side but failed. However, the reliability of these stories is questionable. What is certain is that in 1956, a Swiss group conquered the summit. China claimed its own success from the north in 1960, but this ascent never received official recognition and raises many questions. And then, in 1963, the United States finally reached Everest. This ascent would become one of the most technically sophisticated in the history of mountaineering, and it is the one we will analyze today. But we must start from the beginning. The year 1963 was the height of the confrontation between two systems. The Caribbean Missile Crisis had just passed, leaving behind an aftertaste of how close the world had come to the brink. The moon race was gaining momentum, weapons were multiplying, and the rivalry encompassed absolutely all spheres. Sports, science, technology. The mountains were no exception. 10 years had passed since Hillary and Norgay's triumph on the world's highest point. In that time, only a few people had stood on the summit. There were many who wished to, but few were lucky. Everest remained a symbol. For America, the ascent became a matter of national prestige. Not just a sporting achievement, but a demonstration of power. In 1963, the Americans formed a massive, meticulously prepared expedition, equipped with state-of-the-art technology. Failure was not an option. The mission, to reach the summit of Everest. It was a matter of national importance. At the helm was 44-year-old Norman Dyrenforth, a Swiss-born American, the strongest climber of his time. A man with a reputation, capable of assembling a dream team. Before this, all Himalayan campaigns resembled military operations. A huge crowd of people would lay siege to the mountain for months, establishing a chain of camps and hauling tons of supplies upward. Decisions were made by one man, the expedition leader. His word was law. The hierarchy was as rigid as in the army. Visually, the American expedition differed little from its predecessors. They hired 900 porters alone, who carried 27 tons of equipment up to the camps. The numbers were impressive even for that time. But Dyrenforth proved to be a perceptive leader and gave the climbers more freedom. Important issues were decided in general meetings where everyone could have their say. When climber Jake Breitenbach died under a collapsing serac in the Khumbu icefall on March 23, 1963, Dyrenforth put the question of ending the expedition to a vote. The death of a comrade is always a blow. The Khumbu icefall does not forgive mistakes, and a serac weighing several tons crushed Breitenbach instantly. The majority voted to continue. It was a difficult decision, but an understandable one. They had not come here to turn back. Dyrenforth's trump card was his elite climbers. He had gathered the best of American mountaineering, men who had proven their strength on other peaks. He had also developed a detailed plan of ascent, or rather, several plans for different scenarios. Plan A. Plan B. Backup options. His strategy was to send up several rope teams of 2. Sooner or later, someone was bound to reach the goal. At least 2 assault teams were prepared, each with clear objectives. The minimum objective was this: the first American must set foot on the summit of Everest. This had to be achieved at any cost. And by sending teams one after another, success was virtually guaranteed. The plan seemed reasonable, a proven siege tactic. On May 1, 1963, 32-year-old James Whitaker, a retailer of outdoor gear, and his Sherpa, Nawangambu, the 28-year-old nephew of Tenzing Norgay, reached the summit of Everest. The weather was favorable. They had enough oxygen. Everything fell into place. Deerenfurth himself turned back just a few meters from the goal. His body couldn't take it. The altitude had won. But it was a success. The mission was accomplished. An American stood on the highest point on the planet. The box was ticked. National prestige was restored. However, Deerenfurth had several assault teams, and to conquer Everest by the classic route was without a doubt an achievement, but it meant repeating the British route. No record, no first ascent, just another flag on the summit. And Deerenfurth, as mentioned, listened to his team's opinions and gave the climbers a certain freedom. 2 of them, Tom Hornbein and Willie Unsolved, dared to propose an entirely new plan. They wanted to climb Everest via the West Ridge. It was a completely new, unclimbed route. Technically, it was monstrously difficult. Cliffs, couloirs, sections where a single slip meant a fall of several kilometers. Even today, decades later, only a few climbers have followed it. The mortality rate there is enormous. Almost half of the attempts end in tragedy. It was ambitious and dangerous, the line between courage and madness. The West Ridge ascent was led by Tom Hornbein, a 32-year-old anesthesiologist from St. Louis. Louis and Willie Unsolved, a 36-year-old Peace Corps employee from Kathmandu. Both were experienced. Both had character. 3 years earlier, they had made the first ascent of the steep and dangerous Masherbrum in Pakistan, 7,659 meters. Only Unsolved and George Bell reached the summit then. The route was difficult, but they managed it. This brought them closer. When you spend weeks at high altitude, you get to know a person better than in years of ordinary life. With all due respect to Whitaker's achievement, the first American on Everest, they were not impressed by the route via the South Col. For them, it was too simple, not prestigious enough, a well-trodden path. They wanted a record, a first ascent, to go where no one had gone before, to leave their own mark on history, not just retrace someone else's path. In their opinion, there was only one challenge worthy of the effort: the West Ridge of Everest. Even now, 60 years later, this route is considered one of the most difficult in world mountaineering. Not just difficult, extreme. Climber Barry Bishop wrote of it, "It is, without a doubt, the most significant American climb in the Himalayas to date, and it happened 6 decades ago. Little has changed since then." Using aerial photography, they sketched out a draft of the route. They spent hours studying the photos, considering options, looking for weaknesses in the face. But even on paper, it all looked terrifying, nothing but question marks. From base camp through the Khumbu Icefall, the West Ridge route follows the first 2 camps of the classic South Col route. This part is familiar. From there, it turns left, ascending the west shoulder at 7,800 meters, then traverses towards Tibet along the gigantic north face of Everest. The exposure is terrifying. The wind batters from the north, knocking you off your feet, and the temperature drops to -40. Then, the climbers ascend a steep snow band resembling a double black diamond ski run. The 1963 team named this section the Hornbein Couloir, a narrow corridor flanked by cliffs with a constant shower of snow and rocks from above. After that, it's back to the ridge proper, where a chain of rock outcroppings rises 1,216 meters above the western Quim. This path leads to the summit, straight on, with no detours, no compromises. A few words about the team that dared such a climb. Hornbein gave the impression of being both a pedant and a man of incredible self-confidence. A doctor by training, he approached mountaineering like a scientific experiment. He might turn off his oxygen at 8,300 meters to write a letter home and study the effect of hypoxia on his own handwriting. His composure bordered on madness. He was interested in limits, of his body, of his mind. Unsolved was a kind of charismatic fanatic. He named his daughter Nanda Devi after the second highest peak in India. For him, mountains were not a sport, but a way of life, a philosophy. He considered risk an essential element of a successful ascent and was a very distinctive personality. Without risk, there is no real life. That was his creed. From evening conversations recorded as part of a psychological study commissioned by the U.S. Navy, studying people under stress and in isolation, we know that Hornbein and Unsolved presented their position to Dyenfirth and the 16 other members of the expedition. The atmosphere was tense. Some were supportive, others were silent, and a third group spoke out openly against it. At first, Dyenfirth wanted nothing to do with it. He refused categorically. Unsolved later recalled, "He didn't take the West Ridge seriously. He was obsessed with achieving the stated goal of the expedition. Only when the entire team decisively supported the West Ridge attempt did he begin to change his mind. Peer pressure worked." But the leader hesitated. Diary entries show that Dyenfirth believed Hornbein was willing to jeopardize the success of the entire mission. Egoism or courage, the line was blurred. In a video report, Unsolved expressed his dissatisfaction with Dyenfirth's decisions. The Sherpas were pulled off the West Ridge and concentrated on the coal route. Additional climbers were moved there. In our view, this demonstrated Norman's indecisiveness. He lacked the will to implement the West Ridge plan. Besides, the initial plans came easily to him, and he changed them with extreme carelessness. The resentment was palpable in every word. The situation calmed down a bit only on May 1, 1963, when the first Americans set foot on the summit. The expedition's objective was met. The tension eased. From then on, they could improvise. The main goal was achieved, the rest was a bonus. Dyenfirth still had several assault teams that he planned to send up the classic route via the South Col. Unsolved and Hornbein were left to their own devices. Do what you want, but at your own risk. Hardly anyone seriously expected them to succeed. If they made it up the West Ridge, great. Well done. If not, no big deal. The expedition's main goal had already been achieved, so everyone could breathe a sigh of relief. But the climbers persisted with their idea, stubbornly, methodically, ignoring the doubts. In his diary, Dyenfirth called it insane fanaticism. Maybe it was. Hornbein clashed with glaciologist Maynard Miller when the latter declared, "Now that the mountain has been climbed, we should focus our main efforts on scientific research." It was logical. The scientists hadn't come just for a flag on the summit. The climbers didn't see it that way. For them, only the new route up the West Ridge mattered. Science could wait. During Whitaker and Gambu's ascent, 75 of the 95 oxygen bottles allocated to the coal team had been used. The resource was depleted. But Dyrenfurth still planned to send up a second group. Resources were dwindling, and he faced a choice: send several more teams up the classic route, which almost guaranteed success, or trust Hornbein and Unsolved and take a chance on their crazy first ascent. Reallocate the bottles? Divide the forces? Every decision had consequences. Meanwhile, Unsolved, Hornbein, Corbett, Emerson, the expedition's radio operator Al Otten, and 5 Sherpas were busy carrying loads up the west flank to supply Camp 3 and establish Camp 4 at 7,500 meters. Each trip was an ordeal. Backpacks weighing 20 kilograms, not enough air, lungs burning, every step taken with immense effort. On the night of May 16, a storm wind on the west slope nearly buried their endeavor. Hornbein and Unsolved were sleeping in a tent at Camp 4. Their sleep was light. You can't relax at that altitude. Unsolved recalls, "Suddenly, we were woken by a shout from Al Otten. He stuck his head through the door and yelled that the tents had been blown away." His voice was breaking, panic in his tone. "It took us a moment to realize what was happening. At first, it seemed like a dream. It couldn't be real. But eventually, we decided to go out and check. Where the 4-man tents had been, we found only a furrow in the snow, leading down into the darkness, as if a giant plow had cut across the slope. Unsolved, Hornbein, and Otten followed the track down the slope, 45 meters towards Tibet. The snow crunched under their boots. The wind tore the breath from their lungs. Their headlamps barely pierced the darkness. There they found the overturned tents. The fabric was ripped, the poles bent. Inside were still Corbett and Tashi Sherpa, alive, whole, in shock. Corbett remembers, "No one was hurt, a miracle. I was just dragging my hands along the floor of the tent, trying to figure out what was happening. The floor became the ceiling a wall. We didn't know which way we were moving. It was very scary, because to the south of us lay the Western Qum. At that moment, we were on top of a multi-kilometer cliff. Another 10 meters, and it would have been over." The tents were shredded, but the men were safe. They were incredibly lucky. Unsolved recalls, "One large pole stuck out like a pylon in the middle, and a ragged piece of fabric flapped in the wind like a flag. There were huge holes and tears all over the tent. Gear was scattered everywhere, some of it blown away. We never found some things." Corbett and Tashi Sherpa spent the night in the ruined tent, trying not to freeze. They huddled together, sharing a sleeping bag. Otten joined Hornbein and Unsolved, cramped but safer. The next morning, the wind intensified, gusting up to 160 kilometers per hour. The storm was raging. The men lay flat, clinging to their ice axes to avoid being blown into the sky over China. Their fingers grew numb from the cold, but letting go meant death in a single gust. The storm finally subsided, but the consequences were grim. The West Ridge team had lost too much equipment to establish and supply the last 2 camps planned for the summit push. Ropes were gone, some oxygen bottles were missing, food was scattered across the slope. Corbett says, "We also thought the West Ridge was doomed, that this ascent would not happen, it was over." But that night, Hornbein came up with a new plan. He kicked the sleeping Unsolved in the ribs with his knee and started talking. His voice was quiet but insistent. Instead of trying to establish and supply 2 more camps above Camp 4, they would all go together to an altitude of 8,700 meters and pitch a single 2-man tent. That would be Camp 5. Minimalism at the edge of possibility. The support team would descend, while Hornbein and Unsolved would spend the night there and attempt the remaining 600 meters to the summit via a steep couloir of crumbling rock. Then they would descend to the South Col and spend the night at Camp 6. A traverse over the summit. No one had ever done that. It was a truly insane plan. Spending the night at 8,700 meters was practically a death sentence. At that altitude, the body begins to die. Cells perish from lack of oxygen. The brain shuts down non-essential functions. And they were planning to spend the night at that height, ascend to the summit, cross over it, and then descend via the classic South Col route. And then spend another night at Camp 6, also above 8,000 meters. 2 nights above the death zone. It was incredible. A suicide by installment plan. But surprisingly, when they radioed their plan to Dyrenforth, he agreed. His voice on the radio was calm, almost indifferent. It's unclear what influenced him. Perhaps it was because Everest had already been climbed by Americans, and risks could be taken. The main objective was accomplished. The rest was on the consciences of the daredevils. Or maybe someone simply convinced him. But the West Ridge ascent was approved. A green light. In his writings, Hornbein aptly described his plan as a final, desperate attempt. No exaggeration. By the standards of the time, the idea of gaining 1,100 vertical meters on steep, unknown, unprotected terrain in 2 days, all above 7,500 meters, and then descending an unfamiliar route, was tantamount to suicide. No one had done it. They didn't have the technology, they didn't have the experience, only willpower. If something went wrong after they set out on the second day, the terrain would be too steep. They wouldn't have enough gear, and they simply wouldn't have the strength to descend back the way they came. One mistake, and it would be the end. After Corbett and the Sherpas left them at Camp 5, they would have to either reach the summit or die. There was no third option. However, if they succeeded, this climb would go down in history, forever. The 1963 American team had originally planned a classic-style ascent, but on May 22nd, Hornbein and Unsolved ushered in a new era of mountaineering, bold, light, and fast alpine-style climbs that would later greatly influence the development of the entire discipline. The revolution began here. On the night of May 21, Corbett, Otten, and a team of 5 Sherpas led Hornbein and Unsolved to a 45-centimeter wide ledge just below the sandstone band known as the Yellow Band. The platform was tiny, no room to turn, one wrong step and you'd fall. Climber Corbett remembers, Ang Dorgier came up with a load. Gasping for breath, he sat down, tore the oxygen mask from his face, stuck a cigarette between his teeth, and lit it. We were at 8,400 meters. Everyone stared at him in amazement, smoking at such an altitude. But he didn't care. The team helped Hornbein and Unsolved prepare a spot for the 2-man tent, leveling the snow, clearing rocks, and setting up guy lines. They said their goodbyes, knowing they might be seeing each other for the last time. The handshakes were long, the gazes heavy. Corbett says, all 3 of us admitted we were sobbing beneath our oxygen masks. No one saw the tears, but everyone knew. That evening, Hornbein and Unsolved ate a meal intended for 4, chicken soup with rice and grapefruit slices. Their bodies craved calories. They needed to store energy. They had no appetite, but they forced themselves to swallow spoonful after spoonful. Hornbein wrote a letter to his wife, which he would only see again if he made it to the summit. He left the envelope in the tent. If he didn't return, someone would find it. At 4 in the morning, they woke up. No alarm was needed. Their bodies knew it was time. They ate, strapped on their crampons in the dark. The metal clanked in the cold, their fingers clumsy. And shortly before 7, they left the camp for good. They left the tent as it was. They didn't plan on coming back. First, they climbed the couloir that cuts through the yellow band. Snow crumbled under their feet. Crampons scraped against rock with an unpleasant grating sound. Where the couloir narrowed at the top, they had to hammer pitons into the crumbling rock. Every hammer blow risked bringing down a section of rock. The metal went in reluctantly and didn't feel secure, but they had no choice. By noon, they reached the upper slopes of the mountain, but got lost and couldn't figure out which way led to the summit. Everything around them looked the same: white, endless, hostile. Willie Unsolved recalls, "The mountain is so huge, and the view from it is so different when you're right in the middle of it, that we couldn't tell if we were in the westernmost couloir or the easternmost." There were no landmarks. The map didn't help. They radioed Whitaker at base camp to see if he could point them in the right direction. The radio crackled. The connection was intermittent. But he could see almost nothing because of the blizzard raging that day. The clouds obscured everything. When Willie Unsolved told Whitaker they were past the point of no return, Whitaker immediately tried to persuade them to turn around and descend. His voice was tense, almost pleading. A recording of the conversation says, "Hey guys, I want you to think this through carefully. I don't like this at all. You always need to have a backup way off the mountain. You understand that?" But the climbers refused to descend. Briefly, firmly, they didn't argue. Hornbein and Unsolved decided that traversing back to the West Ridge would lead them to the summit. Intuition against logic. At 3 in the afternoon, in the middle of the traverse, they reached a rocky slab and stopped to eat some smoked salmon. The fish was frozen, difficult to chew, but it was food, calories, fuel. At almost the same moment, unbeknownst to them and to anyone else in the expedition, the assault team on the classic South Col route reached the summit. These were other climbers from Dyrenforth's expedition, Bishop and Jerstad. They were 300 meters above Unsolved and Hornbein, two groups on the same mountain, unaware of each other. The team reached the summit at about 3:15 p.m. in high winds. Although they had a radio, they couldn't turn it on. The battery was dead, the contacts frozen. So Dyrenforth and the others didn't know they had reached the summit or what had happened to them at all. Silence on the radio is always a bad sign. By today's standards, Bishop and Jerstad arrived well past a reasonable time. 3 in the afternoon is late, very late. Seeing no sign of the West Ridge team, they assumed they had turned back and started their descent. It was logical. Who would climb so late? However, Hornbein and Unsolved, of course, had no time to turn back. They pushed forward. When they completed the traverse back to the ridge proper, they were met by a series of rocky cliffs. The steepness was extreme. They took off their crampons, useless on rock, they only get in the way, and they began to climb. Hands gripped ledges, boots searched for footholds. Every meter was a struggle. Finally, at 6:15 p.m., Unsolved stopped and began to inspect the rope. The fabric was frayed, a few strands were broken, but it held. In an interview with Bishop after the climb, he described the moment he saw the flag that Whitaker had planted 3 weeks earlier. He says, "Suddenly, plodding heavily forward with my head down, I looked up and about 40 feet ahead saw the American flag, shining in the slanting rays of the sun and flapping in the wind. It was wrapped once around its pole and only slightly tattered. I froze. I couldn't believe my eyes." And so, the climbers reached the highest point on the planet, Mount Everest, via the West Ridge, a new, incredibly difficult route. They stood on the summit, but there was no time to celebrate. The day was ending, the sun was already touching the horizon, the shadows grew long, and they still had a long descent ahead of them, the most dangerous part. Reaching the summit is one thing, but most accidents happen on the descent. Fatigue, euphoria, loss of concentration, a deadly combination. On the summit, Willie Unsolved turned on his radio and reported the ascent. His voice trembled with exertion and cold. Maynard Miller answered from Camp 2. He was overjoyed, shouting, laughing, unable to believe it. But he immediately wanted to know if there were any signs of Bishop and Jerstad, with whom they had lost contact and who were missing on the mountain. Joy was mixed with anxiety.
"Yes," Unsolved replied. "There's a faint line of tracks visible. We can barely see them in the deep twilight. We can reach them. Without them," he recalls, "I'm sure we would have descended the wrong ridge. Those tracks became our guide, our only one." For the next hour, the pair descended blindly. Darkness fell swiftly, as it always does in the mountains. They awkwardly rappelled down the famous Hillary Step, a 12-meter vertical section requiring full concentration. And soon, they were plunged into darkness. Complete, absolute darkness. Hornbein remembers, "Willie disappeared from view on the col. I shouted for him to wait. My voice was lost in the wind. Unsolved's headlamp had almost died. The batteries were fading, the light flickered, and the tracks vanished from sight. They descended aimlessly, stumbling, falling, getting up again, until Hornbein suggested changing the batteries one last time. They had no more left. This was their last chance."
And then we saw the tracks again, faint but visible. We started shouting into the darkness, and someone shouted back. A distant voice, but it was a voice. Unsolved recalls, "For the first time in my life, I used the international distress signal, 3 consecutive yodels. It sounded strange at 8,000 meters, but it worked. We had almost lost hope when we suddenly heard a reply. Someone was there." Bishop and Jerstad were still descending. They too were lost and were just sitting in the snow, a bad sign. This is how climbers die. They sit down to rest and never get up again. Jerstad recalls, "It was around 7:30 p.m. when we first heard their voices. For a moment, we thought we were going crazy. Who could be on the summit at night? Hallucinations? We shouted, 'Who's there?' They shouted back again. The second or third time, we realized they weren't shouting from below, from above. Impossible." Hornbein started descending in the darkness toward the voice, but suddenly slipped. His foot lost its hold. His body plunged downward. He jumped off a cliff and vanished into thin air, Unsolved recalls. "We were tied together with a static rope, and the sudden jerk nearly broke our ribs. The impact was monstrous. It knocked the wind out of me. But I held him. The rope went taut, twanged, and held. I gripped my ice axe with both hands, my boots digging into the snow." 2 hours later, Hornbein and Unsolved stumbled upon 2 hunched figures sitting in the snow, apparently awaiting death. Silent, motionless, almost dead. Bishop and Jerstad were in a very bad situation. All 4 climbers were halfway between the summit and Camp 6. It was already 9:30 p.m. and pitch black. They had been climbing for over 14 hours straight. Their bodies' reserves were depleted. Only Hornbein, whose regulator had likely broken, had a little oxygen left. The others' bottles were empty, only thin, useless air. Bishop was in the worst shape. He could barely stand. His eyes were glazed over, his speech incoherent. Hornbein fished a couple of dextrine tablets from his shirt pocket, a drug based on now-banned substances, and gave one to Bishop and the other to Gerstad. Amphetamine, a last chance to get the blood flowing, to restore consciousness. Unsolved recalls, "We walked and walked, stumbling, falling, and getting up again. We'd wake Barry when he fell asleep, and he fell asleep constantly, every 5 minutes. He'd sit down and immediately pass out. We felt like brutes, but our instincts took over, and we slapped his face to get him on his feet. The slaps sounded dull, but they worked. We kept telling him, 'Anyone can walk 100 feet. It's just 100 feet. Keep moving, a little more.' At about 1 in the morning, having spent their last ounces of strength and unable to move forward, the climbers decided to bivouac in the open on the mountain, to just sit down and wait for dawn, or death. Even with modern equipment, an open bivouac at over 8,500 meters without a tent or sleeping bags sounds like a death sentence. It almost guarantees the loss of fingers and possibly hands and feet to frostbite, if you survive at all. The temperature was minus 27 degrees Celsius, with wind and thin air. The body begins to shut down, the heart slows, the blood thickens. Of course, miracles are known to happen. The mountaineer Herman Boole spent a night standing on the summit of Nanga Parbat and survived, stamping his feet all night to keep himself from falling asleep. The Italian climber Walter Bonatti survived such a bivouac at 8,500 meters during the first ascent of K2 in 1954, though his high-altitude porter, Amir Mahdi, who was with him, suffered severe frostbite and lost all his toes. But these 4 were perhaps even higher and in worse condition. They were out of strength, out of oxygen, out of food. Heat lightning flashed over the plains of India to the east, a bright flash somewhere far below, in another world. There was no moon. They should have died, all 4 of them. But despite the minus 27 degrees temperature, the night was unusually calm. The wind died down, as if the mountain had decided to give them a chance. A strange lull. Climber Gestad recalls, "Willie and Tom found a good spot, a small niche between some rocks, at least some protection from the wind. Barry curled up in a ball, and I wandered around in circles, unable to see where I was going. My legs moved on their own, my brain had shut down. At one point, I almost fell off a cliff looking for a place to lie down. One more step and it would have been over." Bishop remembers it this way, "I was actually enjoying the view every time I opened my eyes. The stars were incredible, bright, close. I tried to wiggle my toes all night, but I couldn't tell if they were moving or not. I had lost all feeling." Willie Unsolved took off Hornbein's boots and socks. Stiff with cold, the laces frozen, he had to cut them with a knife. He began to rub his feet, fighting the frostbite. His own hands were frozen, but he rubbed and massaged, trying to restore circulation. This is probably the only reason Hornbein didn't lose his toes. He says, "I couldn't feel anything, but he must have massaged them for at least an hour, monotonously, persistently. But I didn't feel it at all. My feet were like someone else's." The sky cleared at 4:30 a.m. The stars began to fade. A band of light appeared in the east. But the men stayed put until the sun rose over the curving horizon an hour later. They waited for warmth, for any bit of warmth. By this time, Bishop was delirious, muttering incoherently, not recognizing his companions. But by some miracle, he began to descend with the others. His legs moved on their own, his body running on autopilot. He says, "I remember Tom patting my head as if I were a beagle. They were encouraging me. They were saying something. I didn't understand what, but it helped." Willie was a bit out of it too, says Hornbein. We left them behind, not realizing how exhausted they were. We rounded a corner by some rocks, and there was Dave Dingman waiting for us. He was sitting on a rock with ropes. It turned out he had been coming for the bodies and was very surprised to find us alive. The look on his face was as if he'd seen a ghost. At 10:30 p.m., after a short sleep and some tea at Camp 6, hot, sweet, life-giving, the exhausted group reached Camp 2. Approximately 40 harrowing hours after starting their ascent, 40 hours on the edge. During the descent, Unsolved radioed his wife Jolene, who was at the American Embassy in Kathmandu, and told her, "I promise this will be my last big climb. That's it, never again." Jolene replied, "Remember those words. I have a lot of witnesses this time. I've got it on tape." The soles of their feet were sore and hardened. The skin turned black, blistered, cracked. Every step was agony. The next morning, they descended to traverse the icefall one last time, slowly, carefully, checking every step. They stopped at the spot where Breitenbach had died, where the Serac had crushed him 2 months earlier. Bishop said, "Well, Jake, we took this mountain for you." His voice cracked. They stood in silence. Breitenbach's body was only recovered from the icefall in 1969, 6 years later, when the ice shifted and gave him back. From base camp, Sherpas carried Bishop and Unsolved to Namche Bazaar, from where they could be airlifted by helicopter back to Kathmandu. They walked slowly, leaning on poles, every step causing them pain. Unsolved lost 9 toes. Bishop lost all 10. Amputation. The end of a climbing career. What was the outcome? This route, despite it being 60 years since the ascent, remains one of the most technically difficult in mountaineering. Only a few climbers have scaled it, and the mortality rate for climbers on this trek is incredibly high. Almost 50% of attempts end in tragedy. It's important to remember that Hornbein and Unsolved were climbing it for the first time, forging this unknown route with equipment from the 1960s. Though, for its time, their gear was, of course, very advanced and innovative. But compared to modern standards, it was primitive. But the first American on Everest is the hero, so all the laurels went to Whitaker, although his ascent by the classic route was much easier than the West Ridge, incomparably easier. Little is said about Hornbein and Unsolved's climb. For the average person, the question is simple. Who was the first American on Everest? To him go all the honors. History loves simple answers. As expected, the press treated their heroic feat merely as an added bonus to Whitaker's achievement, not as the main event of the entire expedition, an addendum to the main story. Although Life and National Geographic did their best to explain the significance of the West Ridge, the general public was not very interested. The technical details didn't matter to anyone. It was Whitaker who became the face of the expedition. He got the lead role in Orson Welles' film Americans on Everest. He gave interviews, received awards, became a national hero. Over the years, however, Hornbein's book, Everest, the West Ridge, gained popularity among climbers. It became a cult classic in niche circles, a Bible for those in the know. In his book Into Thin Air, John Krakauer called Hornbein and Unsolved his first heroes, the ones who inspired him to take to the mountains. Willie Unsolved, despite the promise made to his wife, went to the Gardhwal Himalaya in India in 1976 with his daughter to attempt the mountain after which he had named her, Nanda Devi, 13 years after Everest. The promise was forgotten. His daughter, Nanda Devi Unsolved, died in a high-altitude camp tent. She was only 22 years old. Her father and her fiancé were with her, but there was nothing they could do. High-altitude sickness, pulmonary edema, death came quickly. Willie Unsolved later included this incident in the lectures he gave at universities, often injecting this grim episode with humor, black, bitter humor, a way to cope with the pain. 2 years later, in 1978, Unsolved would die along with one of his students in an avalanche on Mount Rainier. The avalanche caught them on the descent. Their bodies were found a few days later. The west ridge of Everest remains one of the most difficult Himalayan routes and will likely always be so, despite all progress. Technology changes, gear improves, but the mountain remains the same. In the last 60 years, only 17 climbers have repeated this ascent, and 13 have died trying to follow Hornbein and Unsolved's route. The statistics are brutal. Such is the story of the first Americans on Everest and the first traverse of Everest's West Ridge, one of the most significant climbs in mountaineering, which, unfortunately, is rarely spoken of.